Dr. David Wolfe is the director of the program on globalization and regional innovation systems. That's a PROGRESS acronym up behind me at the Munk School of Global Affairs. He's professor of political science at University of Toronto. He's national coordinator of the Innovation Systems Research Network and was the principal investigator on two major collaborative research initiatives, the Holy Grail for researchers in Canada. The first on innovation systems and economic development, the role of local and regional clusters in Canada, and currently on the social dynamics of economic performance, innovation and creativity in city regions. He holds degrees in political science from Carleton, a PhD from U of T. He's a CIBC Scholar in Residence for the Conference Board of Canada in 2008 and 9. Has published a number of books on the geography of innovation. He's got a series of 4 books on innovation, creativity, governance of cities coming out. Please help me welcome Dr. David Wolfe.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank everyone for coming out on a very cold Edmonton night. This brings me back to my childhood. I grew up in Ottawa. We had winters that looked a lot like this. Unfortunately, I've been in Toronto for much too long, and I've started to forget what a Canadian winter's like, and this is helping remind me. So what I want to talk about tonight really reports on some of the findings from the second of the 2 projects that Rob mentioned. It was a project on innovation and creativity in 16 Canadian cities for complicated reasons that I'll be happy to answer in the question period. Edmonton was not one of those, but not for lack of trying on our part. We did desperately want to include Edmonton and made a serious effort. We just didn't find Rob in time, or Kevin. So we looked at these 16 cities over a period of time. We were primarily driven by an interest and consideration in questions of innovation. How does there's a large literature in urban economics, economic geography, regional planning that talks about the importance of density and concentration for cities and how and why innovation occurs. We were also very influenced by Richard Florida's work on the creative class and the importance of creativity in cities. So that entered into, and during the process, Richard came to join us at the business school at the University of Toronto. So we were influenced by some of his thinking. And lastly, a number of us are very, very strongly interested in questions of governance. And by governance, we mean governing beyond governments. How and why can and do cities organize themselves better to support their economic development patterns, and most importantly, shift their economic development patterns to new trajectories in the face of contradictory economic forces and economic winds. So this presentation draws on about 4 or 5 of the case studies. I'm not going to do all 16. It focuses on the innovation theme, less on the creativity side, and the governance theme enters kind of in through the side door in some of what I'm going to say. But as the project has largely wound down now. We're in the process of editing and producing, as Rob said, a series of 4 volumes for the University of Toronto Press, 1 on each of the 3 themes, and then the 4th is what we call an integrative look at each of the case studies across all themes. What I'm going to talk about tonight really focuses on the first theme, innovation and knowledge flows in cities. And as the project was winding down, I became increasingly fascinated by the question of resilience. Now, resilience, when you talk about cities and resilience, it's often used in an environmental sense or a planning sense. How does New York City recover from a hurricane? Or how did New Orleans recover from Katrina? But it's also used in the economic development literature to talk about how cities respond to economic shocks, particularly in light of globalization and changing demand conditions for industries or products that industries used to be, quite excel at it, and there used to be a large market both nationally and globally. And the question is, as those markets disappear or as competition from other places supersedes what's available in the city, how do cities respond to those changes. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the question of resilience, the nature of innovation within city regions, and then I'm going to get to a discussion of some of the findings from our case studies. So one of our favorite starting points is the notion that globalization makes cities more important, not less important. One of my favorite phrases, Richard Ford is very great at coining pithy phrases. This is one of my favorite ones. The word contradiction to what Thomas Friedman, the New York Times journalist and columnist, argues, the world is not flat, but it's spiky. That particularly when you're looking at innovation, that innovation centers are concentrated far more than economic activity in general. And the question is, how and why do certain cities and certain regions become those centers and that focus of innovation? And we also know that knowledge assets are increasingly important, but there's a wide literature which suggests that those knowledge assets aren't distributed equally around the world, and that not every region is competitive with others with similar knowledge assets. So if you look at certain high-tech industries like telecommunications or optical electronics or biotechnology, they are in fact concentrated in particular cities and regions in Europe, North America, and Asia, but they don't all have the same areas of specialization and expertise. So despite this concentration, city regions face a lot of challenges from globalization, the emergence of competitive markets, and particularly technological change and technological innovation. I mean, we're seeing that the best example in Canada at the moment is the fate of RIM. Waterloo, which I'll talk about later in the presentation, has ridden, a tremendous wave of growth and success over the past decade and a half, largely on the back of research in motion and the BlackBerry, and everyone is waiting with bated breath to see whether BlackBerry will have a future after January the 30th. And that raises, if you're from the Waterloo region, that raises serious concerns. So these kinds of dramatic global and technological changes exert a very formative influence over how the economic landscapes of individual cities and regions change, in the words of Ron Martin, who's a geographer at Cambridge. So we define city regions simply as the presence of a core city linked by ties to its hinterland. Statistics Canada defines them primarily in terms of travel to work areas. That's the simplest way. And city regions often extend beyond the boundaries of city jurisdictions, and so in most Canadian cities there's an imbalance between the political boundaries that define the political jurisdiction and the economic territory that's subsumed. But there's also an emerging hierarchy internationally of cities and regions. Some of the literature talks about global cities. Some people refer to these as A-cities. On these lists of global cities, no Canadian city currently ranks as an A-list or a truly global city. Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver sometimes make it as B cities on these lists. And then, but we also know that regional centers are quite important. So knowledge flows occur between the global cities to the B-list cities in certain national economies, and from the B-list cities to regional hubs. So in Alberta, you would clearly have two key regional hubs, Edmonton and Calgary, and I will let you sort it out among yourselves as to which of these is the more significant or the most important. So the question of resilience comes in, as I said at the outset, in determining how and why cities are able to respond to certain shocks. And when we talk about resilience, there's a debate and discussion among students of the question between two different, what do we mean by resilience? So there's two, because the term comes out of the environmental literature and biology, there's a kind of a tendency to use it sometimes in a way that suggests a biological returning to your previous point where you started from. So sometimes when the term resilience gets used by economic geographers or urban planners, they mean if a city encounters a shock, how do we get it back to the point where it was before the shock occurred? But there's a second sense, and one which I think is much more important for cities, which views resilience in terms fundamentally of change. And when you're talking about change, the key issues are not returning to the previous point of stasis or normality, but moving on through a process of adaptation and adaptability to a new equilibrium point. And the question is, how and why are cities able to do that? And adaptation primarily involves returning to your previous developmental path or trajectory, whereas adaptability involves moving on to a new or alternative path. And from my perspective, and a lot of people I've been following, the second gives you a greater degree of resilience, because the chance of getting back to the original path is much more difficult. And resilience, again, so we sometimes talk about resilience in terms primarily of market forces. So the forces of disruption are market determined, globalization, technological change, and some people tend to think of resilience primarily in terms of those market forces, but in fact it involves much more. It involves a critical role for private firms, a critical role for governments, but most importantly a role for civic associations, for networks that involve a degree of governance, the ability to bring private and public sector partners together to work on strategies and plans to promote the growth of the city and the region. And in some of the cases, some of the examples I'll talk about in a few minutes, I'll give you a better example of that. So in brief, local governments and governance processes are central to the idea of resilience. And to some extent, you then get into a question of how much control do cities have over their economic fate and their economic future. I've suggested that if you bring these three forces together, the private sector, firms, public sector governments, and civic associations, that you have the potential to chart a new course, a new strategic direction for cities. And there's lots of examples we could look at around North America of cities who have done that. But at the same time, you don't ever start with a clean slate. No city starts with a clean slate. So you're building upon past patterns of development. You're building upon existing strategic assets. These can be leading firms in your region. These can be research infrastructure. These can be specialized training and education institutes that's creating unique capabilities among the labor force that may be an attraction or a draw to firms inside the region and out of it. And also the presence or absence of what in our work we've come to call civic capital. And civic capital we defined as the networking ability among key local actors within a city or region that gives them a capacity to develop and chart these strategies. The path dependence piece refers to the extent to which cities and city regions are bound by their past trajectories of development. They're influenced by what they have done in the past. And that involves questions of what industries have been strong in the region in the past, what industries have been the basis for economic development in the past, what new possibilities may arise out of those industries. So sometimes, again, as I'll try to suggest in the case studies, sometimes the knowledge base that exists in the region through an existing industry, even if that industry is in decline, there may be technical capabilities, technical knowledge that can be transferred to other possibilities, other economic possibilities. But the extent to which those capabilities get taken advantage of and become the basis for new patterns of economic development very much depends upon the strategic choices made by key local actors, the three sets that I referred to above: private firms, public governments at all three levels, not just municipal governments, and civic associations. So in a lot of the work we did on our research project, we were very interested. There's a huge debate in the literature about the extent to which specialization or a large diverse economy contains better prospects for economic development. And these views are often polarized in terms of the work of, I'll simplify it quite, the work of key people like Michael Porter at Harvard, who talks about the role of industrial clusters in supporting economic development and growth, or the Toronto urban guru Jane Jacobs, who used to write a lot about how diversity comes out of the kind of serendipitous encounter of diverse ideas in a concentrated and dense urban setting. We were talking a lot about density in Edmonton earlier this afternoon, and not quite clear that Edmonton has the kind of dense neighborhoods that Jane Jacobs was referring to in Greenwich Village or downtown Toronto, but these are seen as being quite important. So the emphasis on specialization suggests that when you have a large concentration of firms in similar areas, it creates a dense network of suppliers, specialized skills that can feed into the growth of a particular firm. It lowers costs for the firms by having that network of suppliers close by in close proximity. It also builds up a dense and specialized labor market with skills for those kinds of things. It makes it easier for firms to hire. My favorite definition of a cluster actually comes not from Michael Porter, but from one of Canada's best computer scientists. He's actually the guy, I only found this out a little while ago, this U of T computer scientist actually did all of the research that invented the touch screen. So all your iPods, iPads, iPhones, Google, Android devices, all of the touch technology comes out of research done in the computer science lab at the University of Toronto in the early 1980s. Little known fact that I just discovered. This computer scientist once said he was working for a large computer science firm in Toronto, alias Wavefront, developed Maya, the computer graphics animation program that underlies a lot of the animation on Sunday Night Football, Monday Night Football, a lot of things you see on television. His definition of a cluster was when he could go to Silicon Valley and hire a computer scientist to come and work for him in Toronto, and the person would accept his job offer, not for the current job, but knowing he'd be able to move on to his next job in Toronto without a problem. So these dense labor markets actually play a critical role in supporting and sustaining growth. And in the literature then, the question becomes, which is more important, having a highly dense, concentrated industrial structure specializing in a few key industries, or having a kind of broad, diverse industrial structure? And what we found in a lot of our research, and we found increasing support for in research done elsewhere, is that diversity is particularly valuable for new industries, for emerging industries, new technologies, and these tend to emerge first in larger urban centers. And historically and traditionally, as an industry matured, it would move out of the large urban center into lower cost areas, usually smaller towns around the urban centers, where things like, once the technology becomes more mature and established, once the industry becomes more mature, traditional cost factors become much more important for the viability of the industry, and so they start to move to places where land, rent, taxes are much lower. So there's, in fact, the specialization and diversity of industries change over the life cycle of a lot of industries.